Thank you so much. I am just sharing my screen. Hopefully that works. Can everyone see that? And, I know there's a way to make it bigger. Bear with me. I somehow always get confused at this part. Okay. Aha, how's that? Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for coming to listen to this talk today. It's really a treat to be able to speak to those in my own community about some of the issues that I work on. And I have a very eclectic combination of different topics that have found their way into being part of my career. But I'd like to talk today a little bit about science literacy. And before I get started, I want to say that my preference is always to be in the room with an audience, with a group that I'm speaking with. I'm really a big fan of engaged learning. So feel free to pop something into the chat if you want to comment throughout, and I'll see if I can get to that. And also I might pose a question here or there for you. And if you want to pop what you think the answer is in the chat, that's great. If not, we can just keep going, but hopefully we can make it as unlike Zoom as possible in this strange world we've been in part of for the past 18 months. But back to science literacy. So if I'm talking about science literacy, in reality, we're talking specifically about this idea of science literacy in the age of alternative facts and fake news. The media is changing, technologies are changing, and I think how we interpret what science means and the role that it plays in our lives is always evolving. And my slides aren't progressing. Let's see. I'll just do this. Okay. Now, I'm guessing that most folks on this call today aren't familiar with me or my work. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of background on why I came to work on the things that I do and how I got started. So I began my career in graduate school in marine biology. So I was working on what you see on the far right, the very charismatic sea cucumber. I'm a huge fan of these little guys. And I was doing what a lot of marine biologists do. I was doing all of my sampling work in the Gulf of Maine, sometimes in February, so it got real cold. And I was studying how the animals moved, how they grew and reproduced. And this was work that was interesting at the time because it was a new fishery in the Gulf of Maine, and we had no information about this species. So it was an attempt to kind of manage them and figure out how the fishery should be regulated. And it was a great foray into some policy as well as the science, because I knew I was interested in how policies get made. Now, unbeknownst to my advisor, I also took a role as a DJ on a top 40 radio station. And while this sounds like a very big tangent, it actually fundamentally changed my career because we would be hosting these amazing speakers at the university, men and women whose papers I had read and who were changing the fields that I was working in. And we would be pretty happy if 20 people showed up in the audience. Meanwhile, with the radio station, we could be hosting an event to raise awareness about, or raise money for juvenile diabetes, to raise food around Thanksgiving, and we could pull in thousands of people. And it just dawned on me that by adopting some of the very simple social marketing strategies we see in the media, science might be able to benefit from trying some of the same strategies. And so I became very interested in how not just the science happens, but how we connect with an audience, with people. From there, I went on to work in Congress. So I worked in the US Senate for Bill Nelson, who was a conservative Democrat from the state of Florida. He served for many, many years and only recently lost his race in 2018. But it was a great space to be if you study oceans and if you want to work in oceans policy, because the whole state is surrounded by oceans. So I got to work on a lot of big issues, like where oil drilling could take place and what we were doing to protect marine mammals. But also, I realized really early on that I was one of the only people with any kind of science background in the room. So while I thought I was being put there, I came on a science fellowship. There are all these fellowships that put scientists in Congress to go and have influence on policy. It dawned on me very quickly that things didn't work quite the way I thought they would based on my education in policy. For example, the first couple hours I was there, I still kept hearing all of my colleagues talking about R&D. And when you're in science, you hear R&D, you get very excited because that's research and development. And I'm thinking, wow, I had no idea they were so interested in research and development on the Hill. This is incredible. They were talking about Republicans and Democrats. And it was one of many, many acronyms that I would learn during the first few months I was there before I could figure out how to find my way and have a little more influence in that space. But it was also a bit troubling because since I was the only science person in the office, it very quickly became clear that I wasn't just going to talk oceans. So they gave me everything that sounded in their word science-y, whether it was energy, whether it was energy, oceans, even Superfund sites, animal welfare. If it sounded remotely science-y to the group, then it fell into my lap. And I had expertise in oceans and policy. I was constantly playing catch up to figure out where things stood on some of these other issues. And I became a little bit discouraged because I could have 5 meetings a day on upcoming legislation from 5 different groups, some from universities, some from think tanks, some from pseudoscientific organizations that just had a special interest or agenda, all of which would use scientific terms and sound very authoritative. And in the end, for staffers with no scientific expertise, they had to choose who to listen to, who to trust, and ultimately tell their boss, the senator, who to vote for. And so I was troubled by the lack of scientific expertise happening at the federal level and became a lot more interested in the relationships between science, politics, and people. And that's the space that I've resided in ever since. Up until that point, I expected to be doing a more traditional laboratory, work at the lab bench approach, run my own lab. And this really shaped what I would do next. So I started writing. As John kindly mentioned. I've written a couple books and I've hosted blogs at some of the big science magazines where I contribute. And I got really interested in what resonates, what works, what moves the public. And I think that's something that I've really been interested to stay in because there is so much miscommunication, misinformation. And I should say, when I was working on Capitol Hill, this was up until the end of 2006. So I've been thinking a lot about science literacy issues and science policy and science communication since the George W. Bush administration. And it's been very fascinating to think about how, in many ways, the culture has changed, the media has changed, the coverage of science and politics and science issues has changed. However, a lot hasn't really changed in that time as well. One of the things that I just wanted to touch on too is this organization that I co-founded with a group of friends called Science Debate. I'm not sure anyone on this, anyone listening would be that familiar with Science Debate, but we got going in 2007 leading up to the 2008 election because we weren't a bunch of scientists. We had 2 Hollywood screenwriters, one of which is Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson, who I still co-lead the organization with, Matthew Chapman. He wrote the films Runaway Jury and The Ledge. Sean Lawrensato, who wrote The House of Sand and Fog, Chris Mooney, who would become my co-author of Unscientific America. We had philosophers, we had science enthusiasts, we had all different kinds of people come together and say, we're waiting for the candidates to talk about science issues because they're talking about national security and they're talking about the economy, and science is another issue that's inherently going to affect our communities and how we live, and it's just not making headlines. It's just not something being asked about. So we founded this nonprofit 501c3 organization with the simple goal of getting presidential candidates on record on science policy. And we've been around ever since. We've worked with every presidential candidate to present questions in writing to them, and then to widely publish their responses, issues ranging from space exploration to food security to climate change to water. Pandemics is a big one. We actually have both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Jill Stein, the whole 2006 group talking about how they would respond to a pandemic, which has been kind of fascinating to think about in retrospect. And then in 2018, we started asking congressional candidates and gubernatorial candidates to participate. And so now there's chapters of Science Debate all over the country, and they're starting to plan 2022. So it's a really concerted effort. It involves a lot of organizations. You see some of them at the bottom at this point. We sort of do it on the side, but we think it's very, very important. So I'm going to shift now a little bit away from myself and talk about, it's not just me, it's not just this group that's thinking about the future and science's relevancy, science's place in shaping that. This is the cover of Science back before the 2006 election, but basically what it is talking about is, the next president, whoever the next president would be, and of course we didn't know who it would be at that point, is going to have to deal with some very, very, very big issues, and gosh darn it, they better be prepared. It's kind of not funny, but ironic to see things like emerging diseases there in that docket, because we certainly had no idea what was coming a couple of years ago. Now, these are conversations, the idea of the relevance of science in society, it's been discussed on and on and on. But a lot of us who work in this space think back to C.P. Snow, who gave this famous Reed lecture on the cultural and the scientific revolution back in 1959. And he talked about this disconnect between people who studied the arts, literary intellectuals, and those of us in the sciences, and this gulf of mutual incomprehension between the two. So if you think about it, we're trained to talk to each other using a different kind of language. We might be doing things that are very quantitative, and someone else might be doing very qualitative research. So is it numbers and data? Is it talking through how we feel and how we think and what motivates us? Of course, 1959 was a little while ago at this point, so I always like to share someone a little more contemporary, Stephen Colbert, who back when he had a show, talked about essentially the same idea, not at the same time between just those in the arts and humanities and those in the sciences, but between people who think with their head and know with their heart. And he was kind of being tongue-in-cheek. He's being a little bit flippant and silly here, but I think fundamentally he's getting at some of the same conflicts and disconnects. He's talking about how we make decisions, how different people lead, how different people make decisions and form the societies and the policies and the ways that we live today. Now, I want to step back for a minute and as you know, or as I was saying a moment ago, think about the role of science in policymaking. And I'm very careful when I talk about this because with the nonprofit that I lead, we are completely nonpartisan. A lot of people assume because we talk about science and politics, we must be all the way to the far left. Science debate never weighs in on what candidates people should vote for. We don't rate their responses to questions about science and science policy. We simply believe that democracy works best when we have the most information to make informed choices in how we vote. But I do work in climate change, so this is an issue that I've been following now for a very long time, more than 20 years. And back in 2014, there was this big hearing around the IPCC report that had come out then. And John Boehner famously gave this quote that's been often used in the media when he said he didn't want to weigh in on climate change because he said, I'm not qualified to debate the science over climate change. I would argue that, if you're not an economist and you're governing, you're not an economist, but you still have to make economic decisions. You're not trained in security, but you still have to make national security decisions. So I don't feel like that's an adequate answer. However, this quote, this saying, this not a scientist, so not qualified, goes back very far, goes back decades. It was first coined by Ronald Reagan back along the campaign trail in 1980. And he famously said, when talking about the effect of sulfur dioxide in the environment, he famously said, I'm not a scientist. I don't know the figures, but here's what I think. And it worked. And the folks watching how politics move and how public attitudes are shaped really paid attention to that, because this was a quote that really caught people's imagination. And they said, this guy's like me, he's not a scientist, but he thinks carefully about things. And that sounds like it makes sense. So this not a scientist phrase became really, really popular, and it's still used today. More recently, President Obama kind of flipped that on its head shortly before he left office. And he said, I'll just read, he said, I've heard some folks try to dodge the evidence saying they're not scientists. We don't have enough information. And so he says, I'm not a scientist, but I know a lot of really good scientists at NASA and NOAA and our major universities. And this was an interesting moment for those who follow science policy, because a lot of people kind of looked at that and they started to celebrate. They said, oh, this not a scientist thing doesn't hold water anymore. No one's going to be able to use that because now we're in this age of really, science shaping policy and evidence-based policymaking. And of course, that wasn't the case. There's even a book, it's an interesting book that I do recommend. It's by David Levitan. It's called Not a Scientist, all about the not a scientist phenomenon in politics. It gives you much more background on that. But of course, as we saw, and he actually, I believe, changed the, I think kind of edited the book a bit before it came out, because it came out a couple years after Obama said this and things looked very different. Not a Scientist is still around, it's still kicking, and it still works with a lot of audiences, whether or not it's fair to use in any particular context. So where are we today? Why is this important? Well, just to give you a few recent stats, 51% of Americans aren't confident when polled that the universe began with a huge explosion. Now, yes, there's a lot of ways to interpret that, but 51% is a majority. 40% don't believe in evolution, think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. About 3/4 correctly answered the Earth revolves around the sun. There's different ways to interpret that one too. I do national polling with my job at MSU, so we can talk more about that too. But still, that means 26% got that wrong. And this one's a little bit older, but 18% of Americans say they know a scientist personally. That's significant because if you don't know a scientist personally, you're getting your impressions of who scientists are and what they do, specifically from the media in places like Hollywood. And as you've probably noticed, scientists in the media and in Hollywood aren't always portrayed as relatable or having human emotions. That's changed a little bit since I started following a lot of this. We've seen shows like The Big Bang Theory and Breaking Bad putting different faces on who scientists are and what we do. But I wouldn't say overall we're very representative. The scientist is often the big Dr. Evil bad guy or the like freak or geek or nerd. And we don't often picture scientists who are not much older white men in lab coats, when in reality, scientists look a lot like the rest of the population. And of course, I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone living in this community that science matters. It matters tremendously in how policies are made. And I think there's no better example than what we're all living through right now and for the past 18 months with the responses, reactions, policies, social mores and norms around how we're dealing with the coronavirus, dealing with vaccination. But it's much more than that too, of course. We have advances in DNA technology, advances in neuroscience, really changing the way we think about what it even means to be human. We have big issues that we're grappling with related to climate change. Have, of course, the polar bear there, but there's more than that. Ocean acidification related to that, how we use and produce energy, how we collect data around the world about the environment. And of course, coming from Michigan, you have to talk about clean and safe drinking water. And there's so many more as well. But I mean, it's clear that this isn't a special interest. I think in the political realm, science issues are often kind of deferred to that one science person in the office who may or may not, probably doesn't have a science background. But as I keep repeating, these issues, these challenges, they're fundamentally related to how we live now and the future that we're going to leave behind for our children and their children one day. So it matters so much. In the late 50s and early 1960s, science was really celebrated in the media. Scientists were seen as kind of heroes on this new frontier. We had presidents creating science advisors and national people in their cabinets surrounding themselves with what should the big science initiatives be. It was a very exciting time, and approximately 12% of the federal budget went to the research and development, that R&D I mentioned before. 12% may sound low, but in the scheme of things, having 12% was pretty significant because it was considered part of the way that the United States was maintain leadership, would be an innovator, would be at the cusp of, being the nation to create these new technologies that shape the world. So with that, does anyone want to guess what percent of our federal budget goes to R&D today? You can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself, or I can keep talking, but I'll give you 30 seconds or so in case you're feeling shy. A couple guesses here. Oh, here we go. 4%, 5%, 3%. Well, I would like to say 2%, 4%. Not a very optimistic group. but rightly so. So I get this figure from my friend who compiles this every year. Currently, the amount of research and development, so a lot of the science stuff, makes up just 2.8% of the federal budget. Now, there's different ways to interpret that, but the point, I guess, the overarching theme here is that if a nation's priorities can be illustrated by where we're spending our tax dollars, then science is not at the forefront of how we are investing in our future. And that can change, hopefully. One reason is because science works a little differently than a lot of other sectors and fields. So what do we do when we're scientists? We collect our data very meticulously. We write it up and publish it in peer-reviewed journals, sitting behind a paywall, and we share it primarily with each other, the other people in our field who have access to it, and then we criticize each other because that's kind of what scientists do, and that's okay. I mean, that's how it should work. It should be very, very carefully reviewed and discussed and changed over time because science is always changing, and that worked pretty darn well for a very long time. But in the last couple decades, we've been contending with what was called new media. Maybe it's just called media now, but because of the internet and Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and all of these different, I can't even keep up with them. I have my 8-year-old teaching me what the new ones are all the time. Information is traveling faster and more widely than it ever did before. And so unfortunately, we have the situation where science is sort of slowly moving along at the speed we always have, but misinformation, disinformation, bots that are not even human are sharing things that aren't true, that are having a lot of traction. And I think, again, there's no better example than people right now taking deworming medicine to try to cure COVID because someone told them that it was a good idea in a way that, science just didn't reach that same person. Remember that less than 20% people say they know a scientist personally. So of course they're going to trust their friends and family and community and, the people that they listen to the most. This is a bit of an old study at this point, but this was actually studied, how much of scientific research made its way out into the media, got picked up and talked about in a magazine or news article. And the conclusion, and again, this was an older paper, but the conclusion was less than 0.35% of science research that was published was ever picked up by the media. And this is an article by this woman, Julie Selesky, University of Ohio, in the journal Public Understanding of Science. And I only include this because the irony here is that even this piece you can't even see because the article itself is stuck behind a $25 paywall to read. So we're not always great at translating the research we're doing outside of our own communities. But I do think that that's changing a bit, and I've observed it's changing, especially in the last decade, but we still have quite some way to go. Now, there's also been a proliferation of news sources, of course. I like to say you can shop for whatever opinion you're looking for pretty much as easily as you can shop for presents at the holidays. That's become a real big challenge because it's about where you go for information. I'm sure I don't have to over-explain this because I feel like we're talking about it. We're talking about it in our news articles and on our news programs and cable news all the time. But the news isn't unbiased. And it's very, very hard to figure out who you should trust when there's so much noise. But I'll leave that there. Now, one issue I want to hone in just a little bit on to give you a sense of how I approach it is climate change. And I know last year there was a speaker on climate change, so I'm not going to go over the ins and outs of exactly what's happening, except to talk about how we're framing it. Because when we hear about climate change, what are some of the images that pop into your head? What do you often see when you're thinking about it or reading about it? Anything recent? When does it make headlines? Feel free to unmute or chat, or I can just keep talking.
Hurricanes.
Polar bears, rising sea levels. Yeah, that polar bear is really the poster child of climate change, and it's always a sad one. So it's weather events, fires, storms. So the fires in California have been in the news. Well, in the whole western part of the country, all those big smoke plumes have been part of that story. And of course, the storm in Louisiana, Ida, that's a climate story. So many of these are climate stories, but the images that I see most, aside from kind of the melting glaciers and the sea level rise and emissions, look a lot like this. They're big, they're scary, they're drought, they're storms, they're floods. They're really, really, really overwhelming. And they do get our attention. They do get us to click on images if we're online. They scare a lot of people, and climate change is scary. It's real, it's big, it's here, it's now. But the stories themselves don't often talk or highlight or celebrate the people who are working to do something about it, and the technologies and the new opportunities we have. And so that's something that I and many of my colleagues find extremely frustrating, that hope generally isn't part of that narrative. I also receive a lot of emails from especially young people who are very, very concerned and feeling hopeless and anxious. And I just think if we're going to take the time to really comprehensively discuss what climate challenges are and look like and will be, we really deserve to give time to the people working very, very hard to make things better, because that's who I work with every day. People changing different sectors of our society in many ways that they already have, and the stories just don't get told very often. Do not be overwhelmed by this next image. I don't like to put a lot of text on slides, but the only thing I want you to get out of this one is it's about different greenhouse gas sources that lead to climate change. Just want to point out that, we spend a lot of time highlighting buildings and transportation and industry reasons that climate change is occurring. I work in agriculture at Michigan State University. I work in ag bio research. Between 24 and 26% of the emissions that lead to climate change are caused by the agricultural sector. It's often ignored, but it has such a big opportunity to change the trajectory we're on, to avoid the worst possible outcomes. And many, many people are working in that space to get us there. The two sectors we have to focus most on in this moment are the agricultural sector and the energy sector. I also work in the energy sector. So I tend to be a bit of an optimist. I don't want to sound like I'm Pollyanna in climate change. It's, as I said, super serious, deserves our attention, but there's so much that we can do, and we just need to keep our eye on solutions. Now, I survey the public in my role at MSU. One of the parts of my job, we have this big food literacy and engagement poll, and we try to get a sense of where people are on a lot of these big issues. And in our last wave that came out last spring, so this is spring 2021, we asked where Americans think that, where in the food production process do the most emissions come from. And the top answer was the emissions on the farm. And then transportation, nearly a quarter of people thought it was transportation. And as you can see, you can go down the list. But that 13% of people said changes to land or soil. So I want you to compare, this is the actual the actual distinction of where those emissions come from. Here's a side by side. Again, you don't have to get too focused on the details here, but the point is the emissions aren't always happening where we think they are. Yes, the emissions on the farm are a pretty big deal from different animals, but no one's really talking about changes to land use, changes to how we move and use the soil, which has a huge, huge impact on future emissions now. And there's so much that we're doing now to sort of change the food landscape. So I get very excited about that, and I'd be happy to talk more about that after this part of the talk. But there is a lot of reason that I'm optimistic. And when I do go into DC and talk to different people in policy, I really try to talk about the solutions that I'm excited about and where I believe that funding should be spent. Now, another thing we found in the polling is that, and this poll, I should say, it's nationally representative. We survey over 2,000 Americans, and all of the demographics are weighted to represent the US Census data. So it is a very large and very representative academic poll that we do. It's the whole country. And one of the things we saw early on, it's not supposed to be a gotcha poll, but we have one question each time just to get a sense of a big science literacy issue related to food. We saw that over a third of Americans, 37%, did not know simply that all food contains genes. Now, I find that mind-boggling because I work with people who are talking about the policy side of this. How we either manage or regulate or even talk about things like genetically modified organisms. So we're having these big policy conversations about issues like GMOs, where the policy lags really far behind the science. But then you see with statistics like this, the public has been left largely out of the conversation. And that's a problem on so many issues, this being one of them, is because without public appreciation, support for, and understanding of these big science issues, we don't get anywhere. I thought I would use my remaining few minutes to tell you a little bit about the research I'm actively doing now at Michigan State University, and really beyond Michigan State University, because it's going to be both at the Michigan State House and in DC. So just for a moment, I know it's a bit of a pivot, but I think it's really exciting and cool. So I'm interested, as I said, I used to be a staffer on the Hill working on science issues. And I'm doing research to explore the role of congressional staffers like I was in how decisions are made on national science policy. So much of the literature to date, much of the research that's being done focuses on the people that we elect in office. So how are they making decisions? Big picture stuff. And it ignores the people that are working for them, telling them every day, filling out memos about how they should vote. And that little whippersnapper in the center of this, I have no idea why I was kneeling in this picture. It's a little bit odd. But the young person in the front is me at about age 26. But these people, they're young. They're like 25 to 35 years old in general. They're influencing our national policies in so many more ways than we actively are aware of. And so I want to know what motivates this group. Now, the people you see in this picture, we all happen to be marine scientists. So we're not a representative bunch when it comes to staffers at large. Most staffers have no scientific background, as I was saying before. So I want to know who they trust, who they're paying attention to, and think a little bit more about those kinds of questions so that we can better inform the science community to make a stronger case when they are in DC or when they are locally working with their state government or local government. So again, like this is my big question. So what factors are most influential to these staffers who are at this critical but hidden inflection point in the science policy process? And with that, I'm going to pause because I know we have some more time and I have plenty of more slides after this too. But I'd love to hear if you have any questions. We can kind of talk about any of it. I didn't touch on the podcast or anything else, but I'm happy to talk about any stretch of things, any group of things from science communication policy to food science to you name it, to new technologies and how the food landscape is changing and why I'm excited about them. Salt, you're right. Bud says salt does not contain genes. It doesn't contain genes, but isn't it wild that when you go to Whole Foods, you buy your big thing of salt and it says non-GMO? And that is because we're a little bit obsessed about labeling, and there's a premium when you get your GMO-free logo on your item, and you'll pay more for it. And it's a fascinating space right now to be in. But yes, so salt does not contain genes, and also water does not contain genes. So you don't need to buy GMO-free water, even though yes, that is sold as well.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's really fascinating. So let's throw it open to questions. A reminder that you're welcome to put your hand up, and when called upon, unmute and ask your question directly of Cheryl, or write question in the chat box and I'll call on people in order, or write your entire question in the chat box and I'm then happy to read that out. Maybe while people are oh, okay. Bud, go ahead.
I've been very disturbed about the non-scientific approach to medicines to deal with COVID, and the basic problem, is that the special interests have control of it, and the special interests, basically didn't want any competition for vaccines because they couldn't have an emergency use authorization if there was an effective treatment for the particular disease. And there are lots of people who've died because of a lot of medications that were basically talked down by the press and our bureaucrats in Washington. That now later on, the fuller studies were coming out validating use of those medications, and it was the justification that having the vaccines, not thoroughly tested in the usual way, is because of the dire situation that we're in. And the same thing applies to these other medications, some of which are just simply off-label prescription drugs that have a long history of safety. So I think we're in a terrible state here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know which specific medications you're referring to, but I feel like this pandemic is so unprecedented that we've really been flying blind in so many ways with how we choose to both make the medications available and communicate about them. And I wish we had put as much funding into how we talk about treating COVID as we did into getting those vaccines and getting different treatments available.
Okay, well, the two medications are hydrochloroquine, which, early on out of the gate, the government and the media stomped on it, and then later ivermectin, which they both have studies showing that they're that in some cases are effective.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know a ton about the research on that, so I can't really comment.
Let me move on to the next question. Jane Zender Merrill asks, could you expand on some of the positive initiatives such as land use?
Yes, I would love to. So, I feel really lucky that I get to work with the people that I do every day, not just at MSU, but all around the world. And as I said, the food space is a sector that's almost always ignored in the climate conversation, but there's so much great stuff happening. So before I even address land use, things like precision agriculture, also called smart agriculture, because we're getting so good at data and we're getting so good at collecting information, we now can have sensors or use drone technology to fly over farms and fields, and just by the color or just by the moisture in the soil, know exactly what inputs that particular area of farm needs. So we're not wasting as much fertilizer, we're not wasting as much water when these are things we're trying to conserve now. We're not creating as many emissions as a result of over farming. Now, land use itself, we're starting to think about how we can be more efficient and waste less. So a lot of land use, as you've probably heard, has been used for beef farming. And of course, beef isn't going anywhere, but there's more interest in finding more efficient ways to do it. So we have people doing regenerative agriculture. We have some experts here at MSU thinking about, as we continue to raise cattle, are there better ways to do it where we can use the land more efficiently, where we till the soil a bit differently, because the soil can store a lot of carbon. Every time we till it up and we move it, it releases more into the environment. And so there's a lot of things like that. But one of the biggest things that I think it gives me so much hope is that very little attention has been given to food waste, but we currently waste between a third and a half of the food that we produce. And all of that wasted food means we've also wasted energy, we've wasted water, we've wasted human time. We've grown all this stuff and it just gets tossed because there's a whole bunch of reasons. Of course, it can get tossed, maybe it gets lost on the farm, maybe it gets spoiled, maybe we overproduce it for our weddings and our hotel chains and then it all gets dumped. But then there's even things like sell by and use by and best by dates that sometimes tell us information we need, and sometimes are there because consumers want a specific date that they can discard food. And because of all this, so much of the stuff we produce gets wasted. But there's now a lot more attention to conserving more, being efficient, creating a more resilient food system, and actually consuming a greater percentage of what we're now tossing. And I love that one because addressing climate change often feels, when you see all that imagery that I showed in the earlier slide, it feels overwhelming. It feels like there's nothing we can all do. And yet, by addressing something as simple as wasting less food, we don't need new technology. We don't need a whole bunch of crazy policies that are going to be controversial to get there. We know exactly what we need to do. And in many ways, we're moving toward those goals. And you can kind of see these like little slices of reasons for hope across the whole agricultural sector, but those are kind of the top ones for me right now. Oh, and then I would also add emerging food trends. So you've probably noticed in the last 5 or so years, you go to Burger King, you get they offer the Impossible Burger. You go to Starbucks, they have Impossible meat in their sausages. Meat alternatives, which of course aren't for everyone, and I would never tell anyone to stop eating meat, because that's not a fair thing to ask anyone to do. I eat meat myself in small quantities, but we are seeing more and more meat alternatives really take off, and more interest among consumers to both make them available and try them. And so even if that takes just a little bit of a slice out of the pie of what we consume in terms of meat, and it's not just plant-based meat. There's cell-cultured meat coming into the US market this fall or winter, starting in California. Cell-cultured meat is chemically identical. I mean, cell-cultured meat comes out of animal cells. It's just grown rather than raised on a farm. So you don't get antibiotics and hormones in your meat, but it doesn't also involve the slaughterhouse. So there's a lot of reasons that the food landscape is already changing very, very quickly in ways that are more resilient and sustainable. And we're only going to see that continue exponentially continue to be more and more part of how we live. So I'm excited about that.
Thanks, Sheril. Just before I ask the next question, would you mind unsharing the screen so we can see more people? I should have.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Mana, and she asked, how can we overcome this scientific illiteracy problem in an era of political polarization? Sorry, it's jumped to the side now. It seems politics drives the acceptance of true versus bogus science.
I'm glad you got, hold on, I lost my screen, bear with me. Okay, you'd think I'd be better at this since I like work in technology. So I mean, that's a huge question. And, I wish I had a quick soundbite to give an adequate answer, but I will say this, I think the answer is right in front of us in so many ways. We have more people than ever with expertise in science. And traditionally, when people have that expertise, we tell them to go be a tenure track professor at a Research One university. And in reality, there aren't enough jobs for those people at Research One universities. There are fewer and fewer tenure track positions available. And so I think that we have this very educated expert community of thought leaders on a variety of topics that can make very significant contributions across society, whether they work in elementary schools, whether they work with journalists, maybe they go into policy, and we finally get more people seeing a career in policy as a viable option for people with science degrees, that we get these folks who know their stuff in spaces where they can have impact outside of the ivory towers of academia. And academia is fine and great, and it's going to keep doing its thing. But I think these Renaissance scientists that are increasingly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, working across sectors are sorely needed in spaces outside of universities and Silicon Valley. That's just it. But it's a much broader question too. So.
Great, thanks. A question from Joel and Kathy. Do you know how many senators and representatives have science advisors on their staffs? How many representatives and our 2 senators from Michigan have science advisors on their staffs?
That's a really good question. I wish I did know. I think it's probably changing. I mean, the turnover on Capitol Hill is so fast, especially during election periods. But I wouldn't expect it's many, both because, as I just said a moment ago, we're not often told about going into a policy career when we're training to be scientists. I just don't think it's something a lot of us are thinking about, although there are a lot of opportunities like I had when I was a graduate student to apply to work as a fellow on the Hill, but there aren't enough of them. I also think we've become a lot more divided, and these issues have become very divisive. So you might see more people seeking out science expertise on one side of the aisle. However, it also is very issue specific. So for example, some of the literature I've been reviewing lately looks at which issues both Democrats and Republicans are better on when it comes to following the science. A lot of people like to point, my co-author for Unscientific America, Chris Mooney, he wrote a whole book called The Republican War on Science. So he's much more partisan than I am. But a lot of people assume, and there's finger pointing that it's one side or the other. I'm actually on a lot of listservs, and I've recently been getting a lot of emails from the conservative groups that there's a liberal war on science. So everyone's pointing fingers, but it is really issue specific. And it's when you look at who's introducing bans on GMOs, not following the science, it's actually more often Democrats. When you look at who's interested in things like climate legislation, it's more often Republicans. When you look at issues specific to health, there isn't as much of a difference. We're seeing that with like PFAS right now. Most people still haven't heard of PFAS, but among those who have, it's a pretty even, or issues related to innovation and competitiveness with China, for example. Those also seem to be middle of the road. So it really varies, but I think I got way off on a tangent here. Wow, and there's some lightning in our sky right now. But yeah, I don't know how many of them have science advisors, but I do encourage those people who do have expertise in science, something I do, because Michigan is the 9th state that I've lived in. And many of the states I've lived in have happened, I've lived in after working on the Hill. So anytime I arrive in a new community, and I do expect to be here for a long time, I get to know my representatives and my state senators and even my congresspeople when possible. And I offer, well, first I get to know them just because I think having kind of an interpersonal opportunity for a relationship is better than just showing up with a bunch of data. But over time, they know they can come to me if they need to reach out about a specific issue. And even if it's not my issue, I mean, my background is oceans, and now I work in sustainability here at MSU and agriculture. They trust that I'm going to know people that work on the issues that they're interested in. So I think more of us can be working to be a resource for those offices who probably are understaffed and don't have a science person.
Thanks, Sheril. The next question is from Jan, who asked, how or what do you suggest to convince more people to trust science? You've partly answered that already. I wonder if I can sneak in a question which is closely related to it. My understanding from reading books like Are the Hochschilds Strangers in Their Own Land is that there are a very large number of people in America who just feel alienated from the world of experts. And there is also, of course, that great divide between those who have bachelor's degrees and those who don't. And if you don't have a bachelor's degree in America now, your lifespan is on average going to be much, much shorter. Your opportunities are far, far smaller than they were. And I think many people from that kind of background see liberal expertise, including scientists, as patronizing, as talking down to them. And also addressing problems which aren't as immediate to them as, say, living in a part of the world where industry is declining. There are far fewer options. The education systems are collapsing. How does one persuade people in those kinds of environments to take the science more seriously?
It's a great question. And John, I feel like you probably would have a great answer to that as well, given all your writing and work. But I guess I would start, and feel free to jump in. I think, one, you're absolutely right. I reviewed a book a couple years ago called The Death of Expertise by Tom Nichols, which touches on this. If anyone's interested, it's a great book. But I think that there's this expectation that the person with the expertise is just going to drop into a community and tell people what to do, because so often that's the way that we behave. And that, frankly, isn't going to work. I think we can have influence in a lot of spaces, but I think the most important piece is maybe not changing the minds of a whole country, but getting to know the people in your own community and building trust and working together. I mean, I have a lot of friends that are very staunch conservatives. We don't always agree on every science issue. But like, one of the guys never believed in climate change, and just before the pandemic, took his family to Alaska and said he was very disturbed by what he saw because the glaciers didn't look the way they used to look when he had been there 20 years ago. And he wanted to know what was up. All this to say, convincing this one person, who is one of my favorite people, about climate change. It was never my goal to go in and give him a big lecture on climate change. But when he was curious to ask, he felt he could trust what I had to say because he knew that this is space that I work in. I think it's often those small conversations that go a lot longer away than kind of those big talks you see on a TED stage or something. Because often we are just talking to each other. We have to give people a reason to trust us. But John, what do you think? I mean, you write about the history of science. Is it any different now than it was?
Yeah, it's a good question. Wasn't expecting to be put on the spot. I'm very pessimistic. I can't see easy ways of bridging these deep cultural divides. I think there are so many who are suffering from inequality and unequal opportunities, and feel that their problems are being disregarded, and it's going to be very difficult for them to add political weight to do something about climate change. I think but at least as a first step, I think it's going to be really important for those who don't take it seriously currently, those who reject expertise, not to be condemned and patronized, but for their position to be, where they're coming from, to be understood.
I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at the model that academia uses, we stand up in front of a group and we talk at people. I think we do too much talking. We don't do enough listening, and we don't do enough inviting more voices to the table to have those comments. So one of the things I do, which I haven't been able to do nearly as much during the pandemic, is host these roundtable conversations on food issues, which you're all invited to anytime. It's called Our Table, and hopefully we'll be having more of them. But they're community conversations, and the idea is I'm hosting or moderating, but I'm trying to talk as little as possible. So we invite people from, we recently had one with a food historian, with someone who's in beef agriculture. So he studies how we raise cows. I mean, they're not all scientists. They're people from our food pantries. They're people from all different parts of our community to come together and just hear what those in the room, or I guess over Zoom more recently, have to say. And I really think it's only through those kind of opportunities to interact with people who we don't often see on campus that we grow, and we grow together, because we can always learn from each other. And I think there's not enough of that humility in academia and in the sciences in general, but then maybe we'll get a little better.
I could not agree more.
That's why I don't like this Zoom format, where I can't talk to everyone here and ask all of you questions. It's so much better when it works that way, but maybe we'll get there at some point.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
someone hear me? Okay. I've taught a few classes in my day that really talked about science and religion and food production and so forth. And the most shocking thing in one of the capstone classes I would teach is the lack of knowledge in, a liberal arts university of what science really is. Mm-hmm. And I hear that every day. I don't believe the science. That's, how do they even get to the point where they could criticize it? And that has a lot to do with how we're educating our public. Even little kids, you have to go and make a big effort to teach them, ask them questions, talk about reasoning and critical thinking right on the ground. We've got to do this in elementary school, don't you think?
Judith, I could not agree with you more. I think there's that slide that I showed, X% of Americans don't know this or think this. And I think too often we use those as benchmarks to say whether we're scientifically literate or not, when in reality, it's exactly what you said. It's understanding how the scientific process works and developing critical thinking skills to apply those to questions. I mean, if it were up to me, which it's of course not, I'd love to see primary and secondary education change some of their core courses to have an entire subject area we teach in data, simply talking about how you interpret because we're all coming across these like health scams, and there's all this, have this diet pill that'll save you, and then they show you some weird chart and you have to interpret it, and too many people fall for that. And especially with what's been happening with the pandemic, I just think that understanding things like data would really get us a lot further than we are right now, because I don't think that the curriculum is keeping pace with what we need to know. But I think, like, coming back full circle to what you said about critical thinking, yes. And I think it varies a lot based on school system. And I know what my kids are learning now is fundamentally different than what I learned when I was in school, but I've yet to sort of see how that pans out. And my husband and I work here, so they hear a lot from us as well.
I'm sure they do. But that shocked me. Nobody understands. They say, I believe in science. It's not the same statement as I don't believe in evolution. You can't believe in things like these. It isn't even a relevant statement. And I'm just really worried that we compartmentalize based on geography for early education. And so I just wish everybody, I don't want a national curriculum or anything like that, but I wish that there were programs where children were educated about how we know things in science, so that when you see Dr. Fauci on TV and people are saying, I don't like Dr. Fauci because he said something different last week than he's saying now. So which is it? Are you lying to us or what? So they don't think about science as being a process of inquiry. So,
and finding ways to talk about uncertainty, right? Because if you're uncertain, that trips people up very quickly, and you're like, well, science is always changing. That's how we do it. Yeah,
that's how we stand on others' shoulders. Thank you. I would like to talk to you for a week.
Oh, thank you.
A change of tack with the next question. Does a newer soil science work more for the large food factories or for all medium, independent and organic farmers?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll preface this by saying I am not a soil expert, so I defer to all of the wonderful ag extension people at MSU for the details on this. But from my understanding, yes, just the ways that we till soil, how often we like you can plant and plant and plant in the same plot of land and use up all the good nutrients there and release all of the different emissions that can come out of that. Or you can rotate your crops, which is something that a lot of organic farms are doing now. But just thinking about what the big farms are doing, some of those are changing too. And they're also, I was coincidentally, this is a bit of a side note, but I happened to be talking to someone yesterday who works at Google about next generation, like all these alternative meats that are coming available. And and again, not soil specific, but I just think this is cool. And we're talking about big factory food. All the big meat companies are now releasing their own trademark alternative plant-based and working towards cell cultured meats. And initially, to me, that sounded like, oh, that's strange. They're meat companies. Why would they want to put themselves out of business, even though it's not going to put them out of business? The way that these technologies are emerging, it's actually extremely well suited to the big factory meat plants because they get packaged and processed. And then at the end of it, if you're buying it at your Meijer or you're buying it at a restaurant, they basically have to take it out and heat it up. So the Tysons and the Hormels of the world are in a really good place to be producing this stuff as well. And again, that wasn't soil specific, but it's just to say, these are all things that can be adopted across scales, which is exciting and encourages me.
While we wait for more questions, Sheril, maybe I can squeeze in another. Kissing seems a bit reckless these days. You've written about the science of kissing. what is there a good evolutionary explanation for this behavior? What do we learn about each other from it?
Such a great question. So let me just say, when I looked at when I was getting ready this morning to speak to you all tonight, I got very worried at one point because I thought we had not exactly gone over what I would be talking about, and I worried, oh no, did you get everyone excited? I was going to talk about the science of kissing, which is far more popular than all the work I actually do. And I thought, oh, am I going to disappoint everyone by talking about the big science policy stuff when they just want to hear about kissing? But perhaps that's a town and gown for later on. But that's a great question. I had actually written like just a 400-word magazine article on the science of kissing that someone commissioned, New Scientist magazine commissioned for Valentine's Day, and the thing took on a life of its own and turned into a book eventually. But yes, evolutionary explanations for kissing, let's get to it. So there are your proximate and your ultimate reasons that we kiss. Proximate are the individual life experience. Why do we do it personally? The ultimate, that means the reason our species connects this way, why it's so important in our species and other primates. So in our own lives, the proximate reasons, we think, and of course, all theories, our earliest experiences from the time we're born usually involve lip stimulation, lip pressure, whether it's by being coddled and kissed and adored by our parents and grandparents and extended community, or through, until recently, always through nursing, but also now through bottle feeding and all sorts of other things. The neural pathways in our brain start to associate feelings of love, comfort, and security with lip pressure, lip stimulation. And so later in life, when we want to express affection, warmth, love, adoration of another individual, we're primed to connect this way. And it is associated with changes in our levels of serotonin, oxytocin, so stress and love hormones, and all of these things that just makes us feel good, makes us feel calm, less stressed, more connected. So those are our more immediate personal reasons. As a species, you can go even farther back to when we were starting to recognize the color red and why we're attracted to the color red. And there's neuroscientists like V.S. Ramachandran out at UC, where is he? UC San Diego, who talks about how our attraction to another person's lips probably stemmed from our very distant ancestors looking for ripe fruit and noticing the color reds before they noticed other colors. And the colors of our lips became an important signal. We know that signal today. We still look at stop signs and sale signs, and everything that's bright red gets noticed. So there's a lot more to it, but it's a pretty fun one to get into if you're real interested.
Thank you, Sheril. And can I just ask a quick follow-up? I mean, there is that heightened risk of transmitting microbes. So there wasn't any pressure in the other direction to discourage us from doing it.
Quite the contrary. So, the world is a lot more virus and bacteria than people, or even than most animals, and a lot more plants than everything too. But we are a lot more likely to exchange deadly viruses, bacteria, cooties, if you will, through a handshake than a kiss, because we're not usually, unless you're my toddler when he was 3, pressing your lip up against a whole bunch of other objects throughout your day. Kissing itself, yes, it does spread disease, but it doesn't spread nearly as much as you would think. And I don't think, despite COVID, it's going anywhere, because there's all these interesting anecdotes through history. I have this one chapter in the book that goes into the history of kissing, and you can see in the Roman Empire and throughout different pandemics over time, different leaders tried to really put the kibosh on kissing and not let their subjects kiss each other. But it always comes back. So it'll come back again for us as well.
Good to hear. We've got time for one, perhaps 2 questions. Feel free to unmute and just ask away.
Okay, one more. I'd like some comments, probably more than I have a question. What role do you think that urban farming is going to play. I think it's being done more in Asia than here, but you know what I mean? The hydroponic, very tall.
The vertical farms.
Yes, vertical farms. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll answer both parts of that because I think urban farming can mean a lot of different things. And I really like urban farming for a whole bunch of different reasons. My husband and I actually have a little lot in Lansing we're turning into a community garden that anyone, it was supposed to happen during 2020, but then we couldn't gather. So
yeah,
slowly transitioning now. What we see in our polling, it's a biannual poll, the one I mentioned before. Generally, about half of Americans say they never or rarely think about where their food comes from or how it was produced. There's a huge disconnect between us and what lands on our plate. And that's a problem that used to not be the case. But as more and more people move to cities and to suburban areas, less than 2% of us are living on farms. We're just very disconnected from the process. And I think that leads to some really poor practices in a lot of different ways, whether it's health. If we don't know what we're putting in our bodies, that's a problem. If we don't know how it was raised, and even if we have questions about ethics and other things, that's a problem. So I really like the idea of urban farming to connect people back to the land and the way that we produce food and what it takes to produce food, even on a small scale, which is a separate issue from vertical farming. Vertical farming is really neat. I know a lot of businesses and people who are involved in it. I will say, it's really good for like herbs and salads and smaller things. You're not going to get a lot of staple crops. Like you can't grow corn indefinitely.
No.
But it serves a cool purpose, especially for supporting local businesses and limiting that transportation cost. So I think for that reason alone, it's pretty neat.
Good, thank you.
Any last questions?
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's nice to see you over the computer.
Well, I think we'll draw the proceedings to a close. Sheril, I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody in saying thanks so much. That was really enjoyable, fascinating, informative talk.
Well, it's my pleasure. Anytime.
And yeah, keep up the good work in multiple directions.
Maybe too many sometimes, but thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, hopefully I will see all of you around town. That's the beautiful thing about town and down. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Okay. Bye-bye, Sheril.